For as long as it's been around, the moon has followed a predictable pattern, starting off as a new moon with none of it visible, then slowly going from a crescent to a full moon that is bright enough to cast shadows at night, then slowly waning down until it's a new moon over the course of about a month. But have you ever noticed that sometimes the full moon appears just a little bigger and brighter than usual? This is what we call a supermoon. Now, before we get into the science of a really big moon, I'd appreciate you would like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Okay, so what exactly is a supermoon? Well, in order to explain that, we need to talk about the moon's orbit around the Earth. When we typically imagine orbits, they are perfect circles with the same exact distance from the center point of whatever the object is orbiting at any given moment. In reality, however, this is pretty much never the case. Thanks to a variety of factors such as gravity and speed, orbits are almost always ellipses, or basically ovals. In the case of the main planets, the difference is so small that it is almost unnoticeable, with Earth's orbit fluctuating only about 3 million miles, or 5 million kilometers, between its furthest point from the Sun in July and its closest point in January. The Moon is no exception to this rule. On average, the Moon is about 239,000 miles, or 384,000 kilometers from Earth, but over the course of the Moon's roughly 27-day orbit, this can fluctuate by as much as 25,000 miles, or 40,000 kilometers. So, what happens when a full moon coincides with one that's close to the point in its orbit where it's closest to Earth? That is when a supermoon happens. Because the moon is closer to Earth, it can appear up to 14% bigger and 30% brighter than when the moon is furthest away. This difference doesn't seem too drastic, and when it comes to the size, it really isn't unless you know exactly how big the moon is in the sky normally. However, a 30% increase in brightness is significant, especially considering how bright a full moon is to begin with. One interesting thing to note is that while the moon's actual orbit is 27 days, the time it takes for the moon to cycle through its phases is closer to 29 days due to the fact that the Earth is moving quite a sizable distance around the Sun and the time it takes for the moon to complete an orbit around the Earth. Put simply, by the time the moon has finished an orbit, it will be in a different position relative to the Sun and will thus have a slightly different phase. What this all means is that we don't get supermoons every single month, only on the months where the full or new moon is close to when the moon is at its closest point to Earth in its orbit. So, besides the increased brightness, what makes a supermoon interesting? Well, let's look at eclipses. The distance the moon is from Earth, as well as Earth's distance from the Sun, play an enormous part in determining which type of solar eclipse will happen. This is because, by way of an extreme cosmic coincidence, the moon and sun are just about the exact same size in the sky, so subtle differences in the position of both bodies relative to Earth and each other will make all the difference when it comes to whether or not the moon is able to completely cover the sun. When a solar eclipse coincides with a supermoon moon, not only will the eclipse itself be significantly more likely to be a total eclipse, the duration of totality will be substantially longer than normal, especially if the Earth is further from the sun than usual. This will happen in the total eclipse of April 8, 2024, when a super new moon, just off of its closest approach to Earth, will completely block the sun over parts of North America, contributing to an exceptionally long 4.5 minutes of totality. In theory, with the moon at its exact closest approach to Earth, and the Earth at its exact furthest point from the sun, totality can approach a whopping 7.5 minutes in length. Supermoons also tend to cause slightly longer total lunar eclipses, as the diameter of the shadow of the moon has to pass through increases while the moon stays the same size. But as total lunar eclipses are usually over an hour in length and are visible to anyone on the nighttime side of Earth, it doesn't make quite as big of a difference. There is one more thing that is commonly associated with supermoons, and that's tides. For those unaware, tides are caused by the pull of both the moon and the sun on Earth's oceans, and depending on where you are on Earth, the difference between high tide and low tide, which are typically about 12 hours apart, can be huge. For example, the Bay of Fundy in eastern Canada has an enormous 46-foot or 15-meter difference between high tide and low tide, equivalent to several floors of a building. These variations are present regardless of the moon's phase or difference, but during a full or new moon, the gravitational pull of both the sun and moon are compounded in the same direction, which amplifies the amount that the oceans go up and down, in a phenomenon known as spring tide. Supermoons add another layer to tidal variation. Since the moon is closer to Earth, the pull it exerts on Earth's oceans are stronger, and thus the tides become even bigger. Now, combine this with rising sea levels caused by human climate change, and maybe a hurricane or tropical storm that brings storm surge, and these can cause some serious coastal flooding in low-lying areas. Most notably, cities like Miami and Venice that are already low-lying can become virtually inundated with the right conditions, as even though the actual tidal ranges of both cities aren't terribly high, these regions are so flat that if all the factors I listed align, they can easily get swamped. There are things being done to protect cities against the effects of tidal flooding and sea level rise in general, with one of the most high profile being the MOSE project that aims to protect Venice from the effects of sea level rise. However, with sea levels having already risen significantly in the last century and are expected to rise a lot more in the next few decades, the best thing humanity can do is bring down carbon emissions to slow and eventually halt sea level rise. So that way, no city gets affected with tidal flooding, no matter how the moon and sun line up. And that's all I have to say about supermoons. As always, I'd appreciate you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Thanks and have a great day.